It's certainly not good news, and the government will need to legislate now to make the Rwanda scheme work. The key here is that Parliament can legislate to say anything. It can legislate to amend the Human Rights Act. It can legislate to override the European Convention on Human Rights. And essentially, this judgment boils down to who do you trust to decide whether Rwanda is safe? Do you trust the judgment of the Home Secretary, or do you trust the judgment of a United Nations agency, which has had all sorts of problems, the Human Rights Agency in the United Nations?
So is that a decision that Rishi Sunak and the government can actually make? Because as part of the United Nations, we have to collaborate with the UN Refugee Agency, but it is that particular agency which has just brought this judgment to this conclusion, is it not?
Well, international law, unless it's been brought into domestic UK law, does not have force in the United Kingdom. We only have laws in this country that have been passed by Parliament. The problem with the Human Rights Act is that it provides a pipeline for overseas judgments to come in and colour our legal and political system. And so really it's about tackling the European Convention and the Human Rights Act. I think the judges made a judgment on the facts in front of them. I don't think this is a political judgment. I don't think it's like the prorogation judgment which was made by extraordinary Europhile judges and was quite a terrible judgment. This was a fair judgment on the facts and on the law as it is, but Parliament can change the law. And so what can Rishi Sunak do? He could introduce a bill to Parliament later on today or tomorrow to give the Home Secretary the power to deport people to Rwanda.
Jacob, if you've read the former Home Secretary's letter, and I know you have, 3-page letter, coruscating, I think you described it as, she made it absolutely clear that she'd warned the Prime Minister again and again and again, in some letters which weren't even answered, that these were the problems that were going to be faced. She will not have been surprised at all by the verdict of the Supreme Court today, and she said she gave him a solution and he ignored it.
And I'm not particularly surprised about that, because when the Borders Act was brought in by Priti Patel, I was leader of the House, and it seemed to me at that point that we would probably need further legislation that would ensure that what was being proposed could actually happen. I thought it would find that there were legal obstacles and that you would need another piece of legislation. Unfortunately, we had another piece of legislation earlier this year, but it didn't go far enough. It didn't have the notwithstanding clause that Suella and others, Bill Cash particularly, were suggesting, that would have ensured that the last piece of legislation clearly overrode any previous legislation, including the Human Rights Act.
What is going to happen, Jacob, in your view? You're not in the Cabinet anymore. We've got David Cameron is now the Foreign Secretary, who I know is a huge supporter of the European Court. I can't see him signing up to anything that's going to weaken its authority in any shape or form.
Well, unless we deal with the application of European human rights in the UK, we will not get flights to Rwanda. If we don't get flights to Rwanda, we will not deal with the small boats problem. So this is a real test for His Majesty's government, and what they need to do, what it's in their power to do, is to introduce primary legislation that will override all these obstacles. And that's the basic constitutional principle of our country, that parliamentary sovereignty means that the highest court in the land is not the Supreme Court, but it's the High Court of Parliament.
So why hasn't anybody done that so far, Jacob? If you make it sound easy, I was, you know, well, you said this afternoon Rishi Sunak could put a bill to give the Home Secretary the powers to deport people to Rwanda. If it was that easy, we wouldn't have spent millions of pounds on this legal, protracted kerfuffle that we've just all experienced for 18 months.
What is easy constitutionally is not always devoid of controversy politically. And so there are a lot of people in Parliament who are very committed to the European Convention on Human Rights, and quite a few in the Conservative Party. So then the question becomes, can you get a parliamentary majority for this? And I think you could get a parliamentary majority, not for withdrawing from the Convention, but from doing what we did with prisoner voting rights and overriding it for a period in these specific circumstances. I think there is a majority in the Commons for that, and ultimately the Lords must give in to the Democratic House.
Well, we were talking to Richard Tice in the studio. You know who he is, Jacob, the head of Reform UK. He said there's an even easier solution. You merely do what other countries do. You turn the boats back and take the refugees back to France.
Yes, and Tony Abbott came on my programme to discuss this because that's exactly what the Australians did. The difficulty with that is that the channel is not very wide. The Australians had hundreds of miles of international waters in which to do this. We've got a narrow channel. So it's not a proposal that I'm hostile to. It's just a question of the practicalities in a very narrow channel, whether you can turn the boats back in that way.
Can I just get you to reflect upon the apparent ambivalence that Rishi Sunak has to this issue, which comes out of Suella Braverman's letter? Do you see him as not really feeling this issue in his heart, that he's quite happy for us to take in 600,000 legal migrants in the last 12 months and tens of thousands of illegal asylum seekers? Is he passionate enough about this, Jacob?
Well, I think you are right to separate the two. I think the Prime Minister does want to solve the small boats problem, but doesn't necessarily want to take the steps that are necessary. I don't think he is as concerned as he ought to be about legal migration. I think that's a very big problem. And it's driven, after all, by the Treasurer and the ABR, who score migration highly on the grounds it gives economic growth, which is half true. It gives total economic growth, but it doesn't give economic growth per person. And so I think we should be much more concerned about 600,000 legal migrants than the government currently is.
OK. All right. Thank you very much.